Hello, it's me, Apple, and we are here to talk about cognitive biases. What is a cognitive bias? A cognitive bias is a systematic pattern of deviation from rationality and sound judgment that occurs whenever people are processing and interpreting information and making decisions due to the way our cognitive system works. In other words, it is a faulty way of thinking that is hardwired into our brains. It is often the result of our tendency to use mental shortcuts in an effort to think faster, which unfortunately also makes us more prone to making mistakes. One well known cognitive bias is the halo effect. For example, when we meet someone who we think is physically attractive, we tend to also think that they have a better personality compared to someone who we find unattractive. Of course, we know this is not always the case. The halo effect causes our impression of someone in one area to affect our opinion of that someone in other areas. Another cognitive bias is the illusion of control, where we tend to overestimate our ability to control situations where chance plays a much larger role than skill. This is why we gamble even when the odds are against us and we are likely to fail regardless of our efforts. Cognitive biases are highly influential in almost every aspect of our life that is dependent on thought processes, how we form memories, how we shape our beliefs, and how we maintain relationships. We can encounter minor inconveniences due to these biases, like forgetting a small detail in a past experience, but there are also cases when there can lead to more serious issues, like opting for a fake cure to a fatal disease or voting for an incompetent political figure just because we find their personality likable. We can divide cognitive biases into two main types. Area of cognition. Different biases affect different areas of our thinking. For example, some biases affect the way we remember information, some affect how we perceive ourselves, and others affect how we make decisions. Cause of bias. There are a number of reasons why cognitive biases occur. These reasons may include our brain's limited capacities to store information, our desire to feel good about our decisions, and even societal pressure. Different biases affect different areas of cognition. The following are the most common cognitive biases based on this criterion. The overkill backfire effect is an information bias that causes people to reject complex explanations in favor of simpler alternatives. This happens because we generally prefer information that are easier to mentally process. Information biases affect the way we acquire and process information. The worldview backfire effect is a belief bias that causes people to further strengthen their support for their pre-existing beliefs when they are shown proof that those beliefs are wrong. This happens because when people argue strongly against unwelcome information, they find more arguments to support their original belief. The more arguments they have, the more their beliefs will seem true in their head. This is why we find it hard sometimes to change old people's minds about certain problematic viewpoints. The bandwagon effect is a decision-making bias that causes people to do something because they believe that other people are doing the same thing. It happens because of our need to conform and belong and our tendency to rely on other people to make decisions. Decision-making biases, if it isn't already obvious, affect the way we make decisions. The gambler's fallacy is a calculation bias that causes people to believe that the more frequent something happens in a given period, the less likely it will happen in the future. For example, if we roll the dice and get 6 for 3 consecutive times, we tend to believe that we will not roll a 6 in our fourth try. Calculation biases affect the way we calculate things related to probability or values. The rosy retrospection is a memory bias that causes people to remember events from the past as being more positive than they were in reality. This is related to nostalgia. For example, we generally remember our fond memories of our childhood more than the negative thoughts related to it. This is also why some of us think of the 90s as a better time, when in fact, objectively speaking, it's neither better nor worse compared to our current decade. Memory biases, again, if it isn't already obvious, affect the way our memory works. The spotlight effect is a social bias that causes people to believe that they are being observed and noticed by other people more than they actually are. Since we always see things in our own point of view, it is hard for us to accurately judge how we are perceived by other people. This is why we get so conscious about our actions and project how we would think about certain scenarios to other people. Social biases affect the way we perceive and behave socially. Since our areas of cognition are interrelated, this means that some biases also affect several of these areas. An example would be the so-called confirmation bias, which causes people to favor information that already agree with their pre-existing beliefs. This bias can affect the way we acquire new information, how we remember old information, and how we evaluate different choices. Different biases occur due to different reasons. The following are the most common cognitive biases based on this criterion. Heuristics are biases created by our mental shortcuts. Representativeness heuristic causes people to focus on how someone or something is representative of a certain class when assessing the likelihood of them belonging to that class. For example, if you meet someone in college who very much likes reading, wears glasses, and is intelligent and articulate, you may be inclined to think that they are majoring in literature or any of the humanities courses, despite the fact that these characteristics are not exclusive to people who are taking those courses. Of course, there are plenty of people in accounting or engineering who fit the description. Representativeness heuristic occurs when we try to arrive at a rough conclusion without having to deal with complex background information. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. The Google effect is a bias caused by limited cognitive capacity, which makes people tend to forget information they believe can easily be found online. People generally prefer to remember how to get information than to remember the information itself. Like most cognitive bias, this is not necessarily a bad thing. But when we rely on the internet too much, for example, we may feel incapable during situations where we do not have access to it. The Ben Franklin effect is a bias triggered by emotional motivation, which causes people to like someone more after they do that someone a favor. This bias makes people tend to be good to people they already extended a favor to and are more likely to perform another favor for them. This is apparently because our brains don't like it when there's a disconnect between what we feel and how we act. So after we do a favor for someone we don't necessarily like, our brains will adjust and convince us that we'll like that person. After all, why would we exert effort for someone we don't like? The outgroup homogeneity bias is a socially influenced bias that causes people to view members of outside groups to be similar to each other. Since people are most exposed to members of their own group, whether it be race, gender, or class, they are able to easily identify individual differences between their members. However, people tend to believe that those belonging in other groups are generally the same. This is a particularly harmful bias that can lead to prejudice. An example of this bias at work is when non-Asians say Asians all look the same. Note that some biases can occur due to a number of reasons, like how our tendency to apply heuristics are also triggered by our limited cognitive capacity, or how emotionally motivated biases are often socially influenced. Alright, That's it for now. We will continue discussing cognitive biases next time, where I will also talk about some ways that we can lessen our biases. See you!